Hello, everyone, and welcome to DILAN Delivers, a free webinar sponsored by DILAN Consulting Group. Today's topic is why Juneteenth is important to American history, featuring Kenyatta D. Berry. My name is Eugene DILAN, and I am the CEO of DILAN Consulting Group. Basically, we are a team of psychologists, and we work with organizations to build their leadership and team capabilities. Our trademark, our credo is business is human, and what that means fundamentally is that it comes down to the relationships that you build with people. It comes down to working with the whole person. It comes down to taking care of all your stakeholders, not just the stockholders. Today, we are launching our series called DILAN Delivers. And the goal is just to bring you some free, helpful content. And I hope you will find it as useful and as interesting as I do. I want to point out that we are recording this session and that as part of this recording, there are a couple of things that I want to make sure that you know. In about a week or so, you'll get a link that will have in an email that will help you to access this recording. And that link will also lead you to a survey where you can give some feedback about this session. Some of you may be wondering about the free raffle to get 1 hour free genealogy consulting session with Kenyatta Berry. And we're going to choose that sometime today after this session, and the winner of that will also get an email with all of the pertinent information in order to set that up for themselves. Lastly, I want you to note that at the bottom of your screen or the top of your screen, depending on how you arranged it, there's a Q&A option, and I'm going to be monitoring that throughout today's session. And however, I'd like to respectfully ask you to hold any questions for our guest or our host, Hasse Leonard-Pagel, until the Q&A session, because if you type it in early, it'll probably get buried and I won't be able to then find it to ask the question. If there's anything about logistics or things of that sort, I'll be happy to answer those as we go. With that, what I'd like to do is briefly say a few words about Hasse Leonard-Pagel, Dr. Hasse Leonard-Pagel. Hasse is a principal here at DILAN Consulting Group. She is also the lead in terms of the practice area for diversity, equity, and inclusion. She is a licensed psychologist and organizational consultant. She is my colleague. I consider her a friend. And she's also our resident diversity, equity, and inclusion expert. In her past, Hasse held many executive leadership roles, both in manager and director positions, and that's where she really honed her expertise in terms of business and financial strategies. The reality is that that's what she leverages and brings to all of the work that she does, and particularly in terms of guiding her work and her passion for diversity, equity, and inclusion. I also want to say that in addition to her master's and doctorate in clinical psychology from Alliant University, Hasse also has a certificate from Cornell University, their program in diversity and inclusion. She has published several chapters in some books, and mostly in the area of community mental health. She has been an adjunct professor for over 17 years, and she sits on the board of Destiny Arts Center, which is a nonprofit dance and martial arts organization located in Oakland. Hasse also is a sought-out speaker, and her most recent speaking engagement was with KPMG during the Black Health is Wealth series, where they discussed the nuances of mental health in the Black community. So now our special guest, Kenyatta D. Berry. What I'd like to say is that Kenyatta, as you're going to hear in a moment, has a very impressive resume. She has contributed to the groundbreaking 1619 project that was published by the New York Times. She is the 2019 Honorary Chair for Preservation Week and was recently named Newsmaker in American Libraries magazine publication of the American Library Association. Kenyatta is also an author. She's an attorney, lecturer, professional genealogist, TV personality. And as you'll see, she ignites genealogy with a bigger than life personality and illustrious career spanning over 20 years of data collection, in-depth genealogical research and historical content in the discipline of genealogy. Kenyatta's vast knowledge in the areas of African American genealogy, enslaved ancestral research, and DNA has made her an invaluable go-to source for information from all parts of the world. From her features in publications as Black Enterprise, Good Housekeeping, Spartan Magazine, Real Simple, Wall Street Journal, and Women's World. So without further ado, I would like to, at this point, stop sharing my screen and invite our speakers to join us. And I am going to phase out.
Great. Thank you so much, Eugene, and welcome everyone. And I just have to say, Kenyatta, hearing our description or your description, I've heard mine a couple of times. I think back to when we first met, which we were 8 years old in third grade, Detroit Public Schools girl. And just how, you know, our paths diverged. Me moving to California, you staying in Detroit. 15 years ago, we connected again after my second child was born. And now here we are having this great conversation. So I'm so looking forward to it. And thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. So what inspired you to go into genealogy?
Well, I was inspired to go into genealogy while I was in law school. So I actually was tired of contracts and torts law. And so I was dating this gentleman who had an unusual surname, and it was his middle name, and that was Dwelly. So I thought, okay, well, my family, they're just farmers in Virginia. I'm going to look at these Dwellys. So I went to the Library of Michigan in Lansing, and I decided that I was going to look up his family. They were prominent lawyers, preachers, doctors, all of that stuff. And when you do African-American genealogy, it's somewhat complex, right? And it's not as easy. So I found a biographical sketch of this woman, Dr. Georgia Dwelly. She was a prominent doctor in Atlanta. And in doing research on her, I uncovered information about her father who was enslaved. And this would have been Georgia's, my ex, second great grandfather. So once I found the entry about him and when he was born, it had information about who his father was, his birth date, his birthplace, that he was sold twice as a boy. All of that information made me decide I'm hooked, because genealogy is like a mystery. You know, you're like being a private detective. So that's how I got started. And most people usually get started with their own family. But I often say the best thing that came out of that relationship was my love for genealogy, because that relationship ended for sure.
So what does a typical genealogy like contract or program look like? So someone hires you, what do you do?
So genealogist, basically you hire me if you have a brick wall typically, or you're trying to figure out your family history and you can't go any further. But a typical genealogist is research and writing, very similar to what I did in law. So my law background is very helpful. We access a lot of records online, both records in courthouses, as well as records in special archives. But one of the things people don't realize that genealogists do, we're really like anthropologists, sociologists, and actually like psychologists, because some of the information that we uncover, we have to share with people, and you never know what you're going to find. So your typical project or typical day is not going to be the same, which is why I love it, because it's a variety of cases, as we call them, or stories, or clients.
Right. And I can imagine just knowing that there's a specialty area around African Americans, and sometimes the unveiling of images, I imagine, from slavery can almost feel traumatic, you know, like reliving, knowing what we've been taught in school is like one perspective. It's very narrow. That was my experience. And then to actually get closer to that part of our history, I can imagine can be not always, you know, the best things for people. It can be overwhelming at times too, I imagine.
Yeah, it can be overwhelming. And people oftentimes are, if you had any tragedy, in your family, you may not be ready. You may think, I want to know more about my family history. I want to discover this. But when you see images of your ancestors, or images of enslaved, right? You may not find an image of your ancestor, but when you see images or documents with the enslaved listed as property, that is tragic, right? That's emotional for anyone. And I find a lot of times that when I'm working with folks, especially in that area, I have to walk them through it, right? To get them to that point and prepare them for it by understanding, by doing this research, you're humanizing your ancestors.
Right.
So I think that's why it's important. And that's why I love doing that area of research as well.
Right. Okay, so let's talk about the Genealogy Roadshow. Tell us your favorite story.
So my favorite story is a woman named Gail Lukasik. And what I love about Gail is she had a family secret, right? As all of us do. But Gail started doing research, and it was about, I guess she'd been doing about 15 years. And she decided, her mom was born in Louisiana and had migrated to Ohio. So Gail had done all this research, and she found out that her grandfather, basically her paternal grandfather, had African ancestry. And Gail had spent her entire life growing up as a white woman, believing her mother was a white woman. So her mother had passed. So Gail finds out this information. She gets all the documents. She has all the receipts, so to speak. And then she gets the documents and she says, I have to confront my mom, but I can't do it over the phone. So she confronts her mom, and she does it like in person or whatever. Her mother denies it. She denies having any African heritage, denies being Black at all. Gail shows her the documents, and her mom says, you cannot tell anyone until I die. You have to keep this a secret. So Gail held on to this secret for over a decade. So then her mother dies, like 4 months later, she's sitting across from me at Genealogy Roadshow. And I was so nervous because I knew what I was telling her would change her life, because I had so much information about her family history. And Gail's a writer. And so she had wrote fiction books before that. So she comes on the show. I tell her not only is her paternal side have African ancestry, but also her maternal side, right? Her grandmother's side. Her maternal side. Wait, I said that wrong. Both sides of her mother's family. So both of her grandparents had African ancestry.
Oh, so something her mom really wanted to hide, right?
Really wanted
both
to hide.
Both sides, okay.
Both sides. So one of the things that was kind of interesting about that is her husband just kind of said, there was all these revelations, your mother never liked to go out in the sun. And then they were like, because she didn't want to get tanned. It was like all these different things that came out. Wow. We never went back to Louisiana. All of this revelation. And then what finally made it kind of like seal the deal is that we did the show. The show airs, and Gail's grandfather got remarried. So her grandparents divorced, grandfather gets a second wife, has 4 additional children. So Gail's mother had 4 half siblings she did not know anything about.
Wow.
Of those 4 siblings, there was 1 junior, Azamar Frederick Jr. So Azamar Frederick Jr. was still alive. Well, Azamar's daughter, Stephanie Frederick, had a friend who watched Genealogy Roadshow. That friend said, you're related to this woman. Gail gets an email from her aunt and her uncle. And now the whole new branch of her family, she never met, didn't know about. Now she sees them, she gets to meet them, to hear their story, to learn more about her family history. And then she wrote a book called White Like Her about that experience. So that's why she's my favorite story, because you never know what you're going to find, but you can have an ending like this, which is great.
Right. See, it's unfortunate. I know I'm not eligible for that 1 hour raffle because I definitely want to know more. So I imagine some of the audience, in addition to hearing about Juneteenth, which we'll talk about in a moment, they're also interested in genealogy and finding out more. So how does a person get started?
So typically you get started by working with yourself and going backwards. So I think this is an appropriate time for the audience members to pull out their sheet of paper, notepad, if you want to do it on your phone, on your computer. And what I want you to do is really to start with yourself by, writing down all your pertinent information, then your parents, and your grandparents, if you can go back that far. And what you want to do is write down both your paternal side, so your dad's side, and then your maternal side, which is your mom's side. We wanted to know birth location, birth date, marriage information, location, and death date. Now, you can, typically what we do is, depending on if you're a visual person or not, if you have a sheet of paper, I suggest you divide it in half, mom's side, dad's side, and do it like that. And that will be easier for you to fill in the gaps later. And if you're on a computer, you can do the same thing in a Word document or whatever. And so that's the key place that we start, because from there, we then get deeper into the research process.
Okay. So I have toyed around a little bit with ancestry. I won't mention the big one, but I found that what was fascinating to me. So I identify as a Black woman. Both my parents are Black. But as I dug deeper on my mom's side and my father's side, they're both African roots. But I couldn't get farther than 1860. On my dad's side, who's half Canadian, my great grandmother is English. So I was able to go all the way back to 1600. So why is there this is that typical, one, that most Black people can only go so far? And why is that? And, what suggestions do you have? And so Native American too, that's the other kind of element the people I couldn't find.
So for the African-American genealogy, right, it's very typical. So 1870 brick wall is where most people, that's the census they hit. So the 1870 brick wall is basically, it's the first 1870 census, the first census that enumerated what I call the 4 million. And those are the 4 million that were formerly enslaved. Okay. So most people can get to that point, right? And then now you have to figure out, how do I find the last enslaver? How do I find documents related to my family history? And that takes a lot more work. And that's typically when they sometimes come in and hire professional genealogists for that, right? Now, what I want the audience to know, even though we hit the 1870 brick wall, it does not mean you cannot find your ancestors. It just means you need to work a little bit harder, and you have to have a little bit of your challenge and roadblocks, or, the myths that your ancestors took the enslaver's last name, or that there were no records held, about them because they were enslaved. And that's not true, because the thing is, slaves were property. So as property, they had records attached to them, but those records were attached to the person that enslaved them. And I know we'll talk about that a little bit later, but that's really kind of the one big key difference when you think of African-American ancestry. When it comes to Native American ancestry, this is one of our, in genealogy, one of our biggest jokes is everyone thinks they're Native American because they have high cheekbones and long hair. And so we're always like, okay, sure. I mean, I've had the palest people come up to me on Genealogy Roadshow and be like, I'm Native American. I was like, no, you're not. I mean, just looking at you, you're not. It's not there. So, and I'm not just saying by appearance, but I could tell other things about their ancestry that I knew they were not Native American, right? If we'd done DNA and stuff like that. So sometimes when you do a DNA test, you may be able to get some Native American ancestry. But if you're looking for that, and the challenges of that is kind of understanding the location where your ancestors were that were of Native ancestry, American Indian, what tribe, they have something that we call the 5 civilized tribes, which we shouldn't use that term anymore, but the 5 kind of main tribes. There's documentation related to that. Also in Oklahoma, there is a lot of resources there that could help you out to understand more about your Native American ancestry. But the biggest thing with Native American ancestry is, where did that story come from? Who was the person that told you that story, right? Because if it's just the long hair and high cheekbones, you gotta go into a little bit more than that, right? You have to figure out, their location and different things like that. And then as far as European ancestry, as you're saying, or Canadian ancestry, right? Both of those lines. The reason why it's somewhat easier is it depends on the record set and access to those records. So a lot of the records related to European ancestry might have been digitized, more digitized earlier, or records related to Canadian ancestry. So finding records on Native American ancestry and African American ancestry require a little bit more digging. So those are some of the challenges people may have.
That makes sense. Are there other roadblocks that people have, you know, regardless of where they're from,
Yeah.
so to speak, their ancestors? What are
I
some
think
typical roadblocks?
Yeah, the typical ones are the people don't know anything, right? You know, we've talked about this before. You reach a point in your life where you're interested in genealogy.
Right.
I mean, when I got into the field, most people were retired, right? If I'm 25, having kids and working, I may not be necessarily interested. But as I start to retire or I hit a certain age, and by that time, you know, maybe some of the folks have passed on. So you don't have those people to interview as well. So that's one of the challenges. And then also if someone was adopted, either whether this person doing the research themselves, or, you know, or maybe someone in their family, a grandparent or a parent. So those are some of the roadblocks, but the tips for those, right, to overcome those is, you know, if you do still have people around, interview them. Interview, if you, whoever's the oldest in your family, please interview them. If they're willing to talk to you, ask them about their childhood, family stories. You know, is there family Bible, family photos? You know, what do they remember about growing up? Anything, and record those interviews, because those will help you fill in the gaps as you guys have been going through this exercise of building out your ancestral chart.
Right, right. And it makes me think of too, that you mentioned like developmentally where you are in your life. I know for me, almost 50, high five, Kenyatta, that my mom and her siblings have been the holders of our, you know, those stories. And my aunt, who I was very close to, just recently passed. And so I feel this sense of urgency. My mom is 90, my dad is 82 now, to get as much information, all those years of hearing stories. And when I was little, I was interested little, but then as I became a teenager, you become less interested, and to your point, having kids, et cetera, that your priorities shift. But there's an obligation, right, at a certain age, that you feel you're the next generation who's supposed to be able to pass down those stories. And so I feel a little panic, and I try to record everyone, or at least write it down now. And have you noticed that with some of the people who reach out to you, that as they get older, there's more of a sense of urgency to kind of find out their roots?
Yeah, there is. I mean, most of the emails that I get is, you know, a lot of them are very long, but they're very touching stories, but they're also that sense of urgency and desperation.
Right.
My mother's a certain age. She never knew this about her family, right? You know, I want to know this about my family. I'm the last one. So there's always that sense of urgency that comes with this research as people get older. You know, unless one of the things we would love to do in genealogy is get the younger folks involved. But again, you know, if you have other priorities. So I think when you get to a certain point, that urgency, because it becomes part of your legacy and your story. Right. And then like with Gail, her identity, which I didn't mention, but I'll put it in here. One of the things with Gail is that she identified as a white woman. And so once she wrote her book, she did a press tour, and people were like, well, how do you identify now? And she says, you know, still kind of as a white woman. And then folks that read her book that knew she had African ancestry were a little upset with her, you know, because they wanted her to acknowledge that. So Gail had to work through shifting her identity, right? You will find that happens when you start to do this work. And you will also find that, you know, that need to really, you know, verify the information that you've been told, and to really kind of, as you say, preserve those stories for the next generation.
Right. Well, thank you so much for describing a little bit more about genealogy and sharing an example. That's always helpful, I think, and it's inspiring. More work for me to do, clearly, when I get all this in this conversation. So let's jump into why we're here. What is Juneteenth?
Well, Eugene can share the slides. I'll walk through a timeline for you guys.
Great.
Oh, I'm coming.
All right. So a history of Juneteenth. So I thought it was important here, right? Because to start out with the Emancipation Proclamation, which was issued January 1st, 1863. And this document is important because President Lincoln basically said that all the people or all individuals, based our ancestors, some of us held as slaves within the rebellious states. Rebellious states are the Confederate states, are henceforward shall be free. Okay. April 9th, 1865 is when we have the ending of the Civil War, when Lee surrenders at Appomattox. So a little over 2 months later, in June 1865, the Union General Gordon Granger had to go to Galveston, Texas, to inform the enslaved in Texas that they are free and that the Civil War had ended. So between April 9th, 1865 and June 19th, 1865, these folks still thought that they were enslaved. So this is why Juneteenth is important, because it is truly Emancipation Day. It is truly Freedom Day for the 4 million that I mentioned in the 1870 census, especially for those enslaved in Texas. So what we see is the celebration of Juneteenth starts within a year in Texas, right? And as you research your ancestors, or if you look at newspapers, you may see references to Juneteenth Independence Day, to Freedom Day, or Emancipation Day. Next slide, please. So in 1872, a group of African-American ministers and businessmen in Houston, they purchased 10 acres of land and they created Emancipation Park. Now, Emancipation Park is still there, and it was basically created to hold the Juneteenth celebration. So Juneteenth has always been a thing in Texas, so to speak, right? One of our first shows that we did, actually filmed in Austin, was with a former NFL player, and we talked about Juneteenth. And this is something that they've celebrated. And between 1872 and 1980, there may be Emancipation Day was celebrated in other areas and other places, but it didn't become an official state holiday within Texas until 1980. So within the community, right, the African-American community within, in the American history, Juneteenth had been confined to a certain area. But then, and last year, in 2021, it was made a federal holiday. So now everyone knows about Juneteenth, but the history of Juneteenth is tied to that June 19th, 1865 date, when those last enslaved individuals in Texas found out that they were free, 2 months after the Civil War ended.
So why is it important, and this is going to sound strange to the audience, or maybe not, why is it important to American history? Because here we have this historical event that happened hundreds of years ago, right? And in the both school space, K through 12, and organizations that we work with, there's a significant desire to kind of highlight and celebrate Black people, not just as descendants of slaves, but honoring that part of the history. So why is it important to American history? And what ideas do you have on, for organizations or, across industries? How do you begin integrating that? And as a side, for example, I've had organizations say, Hasse, do we add this now as a holiday, as a benefit? And how many more do we add? And I say pause and wait, think through, why, you don't want to just be check the box, but what can you offer our audience in terms of, one, just kind of highlighting and underscoring the importance of, Juneteenth to American history, but any tips you can offer on how to begin integrating this part of our history that has happened many, hundreds of years ago, but now is being kind of highlighted, so to speak?
Yeah, so the key point is that Juneteenth is important to American history because it's part of American history. Slavery is part of American history, right? And by acknowledging this is a federal holiday, it gives us an opportunity to have a conversation on a topic that people may avoid or a topic that may be tough to talk about, right? So one of the things that we encounter, and I say this as researchers, you know, even doing my own research or as a professional genealogist, is maybe you may have had someone say, well, why do you want to talk about slavery? That was in the past, right? Let's move on from that. But slavery is part of American history. Juneteenth talks about the ending of slavery, right? And the biggest, you know, the Civil War is had a big impact in development of the United States. So for the folks that descend from the enslaved, it's not in the past for us. It's in the present. It is part of who we are. It is part of our identity. And it's critical for any group to recognize, I think, things that are important to them in a way that is in the context of American history. And what I mean by that is acknowledgement of Juneteenth. It not only gives the conversation, but it acknowledges that, hey, my history matters. My ancestors matter, right? So when you think about it and integrating in a corporate setting, right, it's not just about a holiday. It's not just about adding another day. It's not about commercializing it. It's not about all of that. What it is about understanding a part of American history and starting conversations within your organization, right? I know a lot of tech companies. I used to work in tech. I did tech for 20 years while I was doing genealogy. And you have all of these like affinity groups, right? And within the affinity groups, you may have some conversation. You may have an affinity group and they have the conversation within that group, but make it a broader conversation. And how you broaden that conversation is by, making it's American history. And so if you have a workshop or if you have some type of presentation or, offer it to the entire organization, right? Don't just limit it to the folks that, look like me. But then I would dare to say, kind of get in a group and write down, sort of get honest feelings around from a diverse group of employees, why they think this is important and why they don't, but offer them a safe space to have that discussion. Because if you find that out, then that way you can move forward, right? Because if you just make it another holiday, then they're gonna be like, oh, okay, just another holiday. And then the folks
and it can feel a little bit like tokenism, right? Like you're just, you're trying to appease me versus really understand the importance of this holiday to American history.
Yeah, and that's what I think. And so it's really kind of embracing the conversation. And this gives you an opportunity, right, to have those difficult conversations and make your employees feel like you're actually listening to them. And it's not just those in the same circle that share the same experience talking about it, if that makes sense.
Well, and it's really about integrating. We talked a little bit about this offline, the intersection between descendants of enslaved people and descendants of enslaved owners, right? The people who are owners, that even though it's very painful to look backwards, it's so relevant to how we continue to see ourselves as being interconnected. And so have you come across any, in your experience of doing genealogy, this kind of fight against, no, it's not my history because, or I don't want to go down that path because it makes me feel bad, which is often what I hear from white people who know that there's some link to being descendants of a slave owner. What offerings or tips do you have to kind of allow us to be comfortable, even and vulnerable, albeit vulnerable, to engage in this conversation? Because that's what really breaks down barriers.
Yeah, and well, first and foremost, I always tell people, look, I need you to help me find my people, right? Because if my people were enslaved, they're tied to their enslaver. So the records attached to my people are tied to your people. Right. So if you want to find out your family history, and that's important to you helping me find my family history because it's important to me by sharing the documents. It's not about being ashamed that your family were enslavers. That that was the time. That's part of our American history. This is
Right.
why we have to get these conversations, because if you feel ashamed of it, you're not going to acknowledge it. So if your fourth great grandfather in Virginia enslaved my third great grandmother, and I can find her name in a document attached to you, attached to that enslaver, and to say, oh my God, your ancestor was her last enslaver. Now I have more information about her.
Right, right.
That helps me. I'm not
Right.
coming to blame you. I'm coming to fill in the gaps on my family tree, just like you.
Right.
All I'm trying to do is rebuild those families that were torn apart during slavery. So don't be ashamed if your family enslaved people. Understand that if we work together and have these conversations and share the documentation, we're building a story of American history that's been swept under the rug, basically.
Right. Great, 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 great. I love it. So we talked about genealogy. You mentioned DNA a little bit. When we spoke before, one thing that stuck out to me is that you said DNA is not genealogy. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so DNA is kind of part of the toolkit, so to speak. So I'm sure there's some folks who might have taken a DNA test and you get a very nice, pretty map and all of that.
I have one of those.
Yes, you get all of that, but that's not the end of your story. All right. The DNA is kind of part of it. And I mean, it's great for folks who are adopted, but one of the really big differences is when you're doing genealogy research, we just went through that charting process. Hopefully everyone participated, but you started with what you know, right? So let's say you want to figure out a family story, find a relative, or you have a question. Well, within genealogy, right, what you would do is take that question, and it's kind of like I call it the genealogy wheel. You know, so does my question or my problem I'm trying to solve, or this, you know, was my great grandfather a horse thief, whatever it is, right? And then once you do that, you write down what you know about that person, your family, or whatever. Then you figure out, are there documents available, right? So are there documents available? Not everything is online, number one. Okay, that's number one. Not a lot is online. And if it is online, it's not indexed. A lot of it's not indexed. But also, were there any type of natural disasters? I mean, there were a bunch of courthouses burned during the Civil War, fires, tornadoes. We see all this stuff all the time, right? And are those documents still around? Then, you know, where can I locate them? What documents do I need? Do I need to find a will, right? If I'm looking for someone's property or information about their death, their property, and their children. Do I need to find land records? Am I looking for vital records, birth, marriage, and death records? You know, where are these records located? And then once you go through that of identifying the problem, saying, this is what I know so far, are the records available? Where are they available? Then you see if you can access the records, okay? And then you access those records to fill in the gaps on that ancestral chart, right? Because all of us genealogists, whoever we are, start with a big ancestral chart. I have one that's like 12 generations. Of course, I haven't gone back that far.
Wow.
But
that's impressive.
Yeah, but I haven't gone back 12 generations. It's only like my fourth great grandmother, but I want to, right? So it's an iterative process of you just going through and figuring out what you want to know, what's your next question. And so that's the genealogical research process. Now, DNA may be able to help solve that problem or answer that question, right? And one thing about DNA is, I will say, even if they give you cousin matches and say, oh, you and I are cousins, right? They wouldn't tell us how we're cousins. They don't give us the most recent common match or common ancestor, excuse me. So if they don't tell you how you're cousins, then you have to do the research to figure that out.
Right.
So that's why DNA is not genealogy, but it's just part of the toolkit as I look at it.
Okay, that's great. So you said a lot about your process in terms of when you get a client. What should I do, or what should the audience do to get started? Like, is the next step? So I feel inspired. Again, I've done hours and hours of work to try and map out the ancestral chart. And, you know, it can feel overwhelming. Like, you know, there's curiosities on both sides of my family. So how do you help me kind of get started? What suggestions do you have?
So I talked about the genealogy wheel a little bit, right? With the documentation and using ancestral chart. The biggest thing too is also in getting started is interviewing. We talked about that earlier. But really one of the things when you get started in genealogy, and I want to stress this, is figure out, again, what is your question?
Yeah.
What problem are you trying to solve? If you have a story, some story, Native American, horse thief, orphan train, whatever the story might be, and you're trying to prove or disprove that, narrow it on that focus, because genealogy can be very, very overwhelming, right? You have your maternal side and your paternal side. So figure out why you're doing it, narrow your focus on one side of the family, right? Some sides are good because people like to do everything at once.
Yes.
I like to think of it as with genealogy that you have these, what I call genealogy angels. There's some side to your family where there's going to be one person that gives you all that information. They're going to be like unlocked. They lead you down the right path on your journey, right? And they lead you to those documents. So your tree may seem lopsided at first, but when you focus, I would say go for the lowest hanging fruit. What I mean is go for the side you know the most about. Right. And then you can get information and you can figure out, fill in the gaps there, and then use what you learn in that methodology research to then go to the other side. Also, please remember to cite your sources. What do I mean by that? If you
feel like I'm in a research class.
I know, well, because
hypothesis testing. This is great though. Keep going.
No, I mean, seriously, you have to cite your sources. All genealogists make this mistake. We'll have an interview, we'll talk to someone, and then we like jot it down. And then years later, we're like, oh, where did I get that information from? And that person is deceased, or you didn't write down the date, or you lost the document. You have to cite your sources, right? So make sure you just write down if it's on the sheet of paper, or if it's in, on your computer, on your phone, where you got the documents. So when you get started, it's again, number one, narrowing your focus. To number two, whether that focus is one side of the family, a question or whatever, or problem I'm trying to solve, identifying the research, locating the research, adding that to the family tree, and starting all over again. Now, if you cannot find information, right? If you feel like you've hit a brick wall, or for example, one of the things that I see is if you're interviewing someone, my grandfather was like this, my very side, he didn't want to talk at all. It didn't matter, I was on TV, he did not want to talk. And so because of that, he very much kind of just held on to the very family secrets, whatever those might be.
Right.
So I tried to get him to tell him it was about family or it's about medical stuff or whatever, but he really didn't get that. And you may run into that. And so what you have to do is just find a different resource or go down a different path.
Yeah, and it's helpful to hear kind of that there's a methodology behind the approach as a genealogist. Because more often than not, we hear these stories passed down from generation to generation. And so on one hand, it's not really trying to discredit, right, that story, so to speak.
Right.
Like for me, I don't want to discredit the story because that has meaning. In every story that has been passed down, there's some moral lining, there's a takeaway. And as I've gotten older, I realized that that's really the essence. There's some truth, and it helps with, shape my identity, that I had a strong, maternal side of advocates and fighters for justice. But really, when people walk in to someone like you and say, here's a story that I heard and I want you to find the truth, that would you agree the goal is not to kind of discredit the experience of the story and how it shaped your identity, right? But to determine whether or not that's a fact, that will help guide you learning more about your history or not, right? Like whether or not, you keep talking about a horse thief, for example. Was it really a horse thief?
Right. I think he actually was, but it's to prove or disprove. It's to prove or disprove the story. And so that's really what you're doing, is you're just verifying the information, because genealogy is really about making sure we're passing down the stories, but the stories are correct. right?
Okay.
You don't want to pass down false information. And
Right.
it's not that you're doing anything negative. It's not that you're trying to put your family's business out in the street and you're trying to, make
Right,
someone
right.
look bad. It's
Right.
really just about completing that story, figuring it out. And I think for the folks that come to me and that came to Genealogy Roadshow, it was really about the identity. I talked about Gail, but there's also, I didn't do it, but there was one with someone that was sent on an orphan train, right? Really understanding what happened to your ancestor. How did that
Right.
feel?
Right.
You're getting to know them. It ties you to that person. They're not just a name, a date, or place on a sheet of paper. It is your person. That's your Martha, your Mary, your Emily, your John. That is your ancestor.
Right.
And you're getting to know their story.
Right.
And so that's what's really important to
Right.
me. And I think that's why in doing this work and doing this research, I have come to learn or know more about American history from genealogy. And as we, we're talking about American history in Juneteenth today, but I was not a history buff. I mean, that was not my thing. But now, I'm all over it. It is my thing, right? Because I want to understand how my ancestors fit into the context of American history.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Because I'm part of the fabric of America. I'm part of the story. We all are. And so it's really important when you're looking at these stories to remember, even if you find something that is, what's the word I'm looking for? That I wouldn't say feel ashamed, but you find something that's disturbing, right? You never know what you're going to find. And you may not be ready for it. And it's okay to take a pause when you're doing this research yourself. It's okay to take a pause and say, I need to process this. But no, it's not going to be all unicorns and rainbows, but neither is American history.
Right.
So,
Right. Well, thank you so much, Kenyatta. This has been great. We talked about Juneteenth, its importance to American history. We talked about identity, which I think, again, there's an evolution for all of us as we, get older and learn more. For me, I think I shared in the beginning that Kenyatta and I have known each other a long time, but I moved to a different state. And so one of the things that I shared with Kenyatta, just in terms of American history, that my high school years were in Marin, Mill Valley, California, for those that you've known. So going from Detroit to Mill Valley, which was a major cultural shock. And I remember in high school, when we talked about American history, I was one of 2 Black kids in the classroom. And whether or not this is true, right? This was my experience that when that one chapter, the day that you talk about Black history, is about slavery, and really feeling in that moment, going inward, because all eyes were on me and this other person as like, this is your history, not our history, but your history, right? And through my own identity and evolution of just, really having the foundation of being from Detroit and having a lot of strong Black role models and family, that I was able to later on in life, because in that moment I felt ashamed, right? Which is a very different experience, Kenyatta, that you and I talked about, staying in Detroit, talking about American history and slavery and being among other Black kids. And so it just really, I guess the takeaway for me in that part of my identity is knowing that no matter where you are, as you talk about American history, it's important to be integrative and not just have, similar to like the Juneteenth, check off, that there are some things that are very unsettling that have happened in our history. And the most effective way for us to move forward is to, again, be vulnerable and comfortable engaging in these conversations. Because as you said, we're all part of American history, both its successes, right?
Yes.
And its failures. So one key takeaway for the audience before we move into Q&A.
Well, I think the key takeaway is for the audience to understand that, and you kind of alluded to it, right, with us all being part of American history, but knowing that the more that we acknowledge that history and we uncover that history, it may be uncomfortable, and you may be thinking, oh, I'm gonna have to learn about another holiday or another event or something else that is painful. because it didn't happen to you, but it happened to a different group. But I want you to keep an open mind, an open heart, and be inspired to find out about your own story and share it so it's no longer swept under the rug, like all of these stories we are discovering right now.
Great, thank you so much. So Eugene, if you'd like to now transition into the Q&A, if there's any questions out there for Kenyatta, or we can't hear you.
Hello, everyone. I am now going to move us into the Q&A session, and there's already a couple of questions for you. And if you can add a few more, and what I'm going to do is just read them out, and then Kenyatta and Hasse will respond to them. The first one that comes to us from Cynthia O'Donnell. Why did Granger choose to go to Galveston, Texas? And did he go to other states as well?
Okay,
That is definitely for Kenyatta, not me.
yeah, and Kenyatta can answer, like, I'm not a Civil War historian, so I can't give you all the information, but more than likely, General Granger was given that task. And the reason is that, you know, most of these records, I'm going to get all genealogical on you for a moment, so give me a second. Most of these records are related to the War Department. And so, you know, word had come through at that time that there were still folks that were enslaved in Texas. So he went and there's a general order that he literally read in front of this group of enslaved people to tell them that they were free, right? So by that time, depending on, and it's complex, in general, most enslaved individuals had been freed, but there was some who was still being held by their enslavers, and there was a lot of work to get them free. But Juneteenth comes about because this was a large number of slave folks in Texas that didn't even know the war had ended. And so based on what I know, and again, I'm not a Civil War historian, that was his task to go there.
So another question that's related, I'm gonna add one and add the one that's here as well. One of them is, why do you think it took so long for news to travel to Texas? And along those lines, someone is asking about how many people were still enslaved in the Upper South in June 19th of 1865. What was the number?
Okay, so I would say I don't know the exact number of how many people were still enslaved. And why did it take so long for information to get to Texas? Well, one of the things I do know is in my research that I've done, as the Civil War was raging on throughout the South, typically once there was a fall of a major city, like the fall of Vicksburg or the fall of somewhere else, they would flee to Texas. Some people from Texas even fled to Cuba to keep their enslaved. So there was just, you know, you have to think of the time frame of word getting to Texas, right? Because where we are in 1865, but also there's a culture of people who are enslavers who want to keep the enslaved, right? So that was their entire goal. If you want to know a lot more, I would suggest you want to know more about this and why it took so long, how many enslaved folks were there. There's always on C-SPAN on the weekends, C-SPAN American History. There's always a Civil War series, and they talk a lot about this, especially with Juneteenth officially being on Sunday. They will be providing more in-depth information than I ever could. I'm a genealogist, not a historian. I just play one on TV, so.
Okay, so a couple of more questions for the genealogist. Do you have any tips, advice for navigating a situation with a closed adoption?
Yeah, so closed adoptions are tricky, as you already know. So I would say with adoption, you have to look at the state and the state laws. So with the state laws, I would look at where did the birth take place, and then where the adoption take place if it's not in the same state. Then look at the adoption laws. If it's a closed adoption, then you may have to get some legal representation. But for me, adoption is all about the law and the state. I don't work a lot with adoptees. I know they use DNA to try to find their biological parent and or half siblings or full siblings. But really, I would say look at the laws, because that's the best way to do that. And there's also probably some genealogical articles on dealing with closed adoptions.
Okay. And then how do you locate information on Native American ancestry? I know you mentioned something earlier. Maybe you want to mention that again, and if there's anything else.
Sure. So for Native American ancestry, there's records. So as I mentioned, the 5 civilized tribes, do not make me recount them, but I know it's Cherokee, Chickasaw, Seminole. There's 2 other ones I can't recall off the top of my head.
Is Blackfoot one of them? Blackfoot?
Yeah, I think Blackfoot was one of them. And for Native American ancestry, again, it's the location of where your ancestors were. Right. So if they're in Mississippi, Georgia, or Oklahoma, Historical Society has a lot of resources. And then there are some resources online. There's also, depending on if you're looking for Native American and African American ancestry, there's going to be a lot more information on that in Oklahoma due to the Trail of Tears. Because for those that don't know, the Cherokee, I believe at the time, were the largest tribe that basically they had the most enslaved individuals of any of the tribes in that area. And the enslaved individuals were on the Trail of Tears as well.
And someone is asking, what is the best way to support the implementation of Juneteenth as a holiday in a company setting without tokenizing individuals of color?
Do you want me to answer that one?
I think you can both contribute to it, really.
I think the best way is to, I'm just be honest. The best way is to ask your employees how they feel about you making it a holiday. I mean, personally, I was happy it was a holiday, but I didn't want it to be commercialized. I don't want it to be commercialized. So one of the things about making it a holiday within the organization is talk to your, Black employees and say, okay, what else would you like us to do? Get their thoughts, because you can have some things where they have the day off or whatever, but also, as I said, incorporate other things that kind of talk about Juneteenth, why it's important, and make sure everyone understands the history of it. And maybe it's just having some email or some type of, or a lunch or whatever, but you actually talk about the history of Juneteenth, and maybe you incorporate hire someone or prepare for questions. Like the first question I got, well, why did he go there? Why did Granger go there? How many people were there? Why did it take so long? Like, incorporate some of these historical aspects into it, so it's not just a holiday and you're checking a box, but now you're actually educating your employees.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with all that you're saying, that, the way to make it not feel like you tokenizing is that there's a real investment from the organization to learn about it. And then to extend to the employees, how should we celebrate it, right? Mm-hmm. Because the thing that I have shared with organizations, because again, there's other communities, there's other holidays out there to support other demographics that are not a day off, right? And so I always look through the lens of equity. So be prepared that if you add this, you're going to have other communities knocking on your door, other employees from demographics saying, well, where am I represented? And it's very different to lean in to say, how do we celebrate this, right? Again, knowing that me as an organization, whoever I rep, leaders, managers, et cetera, that I want to be informed so that when we talk about it, that I have a story maybe I can share, or some links or some educational resources, so it doesn't just feel like this is the new thing to kind of celebrate, as a check the box.
Hasse,
so that's what I would add.
Thank you. This next question is directed at you by someone named David Perry, who also graduated from Tam High. He says, woo woo. And he's curious to hear about your experience about how the history of slavery was taught in a majority white high income school. Right. And he's curious about how it was received by the majority white students, as well as, was Juneteenth ever mentioned?
Oh, no. And I hate to, so let me respond to the second. I hate to say as a Black person that I didn't know about Juneteenth until probably 10 years ago, maybe. So my experience at TAM was, like I mentioned, that again, unlike other kids who might have grown up in California or grown up in that area that were Black, my roots were in Detroit. So the people around me, my family members, education was important, professionals, etc. So I had lots of models. When I moved to Mill Valley, that wasn't the case, right? So as a teenager going into American history, that the part that I identified with, which was the Black part of my culture, that was seen as you were less than, right? That's how slavery was talked about. And again, I remember it being one day, and that all eyes were on me, that somehow, me and my, I don't know, 15, 16-year-old self would have some ability to explain what it was like to be part, a Black person who was enslaved. So through a lot of support and my own evolution of finding out more and reconnecting to my roots, that now I'm, I share this story, which back then was very hard, and feel as though that, a lot of employees and organizations might have a similar story. And so be open, right, to engage them in that conversation.
So I have a few more questions, but I do want to underscore what Hasse just said about not knowing about her own history. And I think that experience is replicated by many of the communities in the fabric of the United States.
Right.
And I think, as Kenyatta was saying earlier, part of the necessary process that we need to go to, I think, in order to be truly one nation, is to learn each other's stories and recognize that it is one story. And so I think there's an invitation there to have a curiosity about other people's histories in this nation. So with that, the next question is, in terms of the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to the Union states that still had slavery. So was slavery still legal in some states after Juneteenth? And the question is that correct?
So, okay, June 19th, 1865 ended slavery. That's it. When Granger got there, and he was, the head of the Department of Texas, or the War Department in Texas, that effectively ended slavery, right? So celebrating June 19th, or creating Juneteenth. Now, the first part of the question around the Emancipation Proclamation is that document applied to the Confederate states, right? So that was Lincoln's way. It was saying in 1863, prior to the Civil War, all of the enslaved in the Confederacy are declared free January 1st, 1863, right? We know that did not happen. So what it did not apply to is that there were border states that were still part of the Union that had slavery. So the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to those states. So if you think of it as a document, it is the emancipating of the enslaved in the Confederacy, but it does not kind of address some of the border states that were still part of the Union.
Okay. Someone says that they are honored to be in the virtual presence of both of you as a former Michiganian, which I'm probably saying wrong. And what tips do you have for those of us with Caribbean ancestry? And thank you.
Okay, so my favorite place to go is just an online site. I think with Caribbean ancestry, there is a website called familysearch.org, and Family Search has a wiki, and just go to search familysearch.org, search their wiki, and then type in wherever, what part of the Caribbean you're researching. Why I love that resource is because they also link to anything that's online. They tell you documents that are available online. They tell you what documents have been destroyed by whatever hurricanes, all this other stuff. And then they also give you print resources as well. So that's like where I would start. There are some records at some of the major sites, at Ancestry or something like that related to the Caribbean, but there's not a lot. So start with the wiki first. And then, as usual, or as we did at in the beginning, start with yourself first, work backwards, then figure out what you need to find out about your family, and look at the resources on that wiki that will help you.
Okay. All right. I think we've covered most every question except for maybe this one. So someone is asking what other activities other than a cookout of fireworks might one engage in to help commemorate Juneteenth?
Can you repeat that question?
What other activities other than a cookout or fireworks do you recommend in terms of being able to celebrate Juneteenth?
I mean, I think you can do other things that are like a little bit, maybe have people talk about, well, I don't know if they don't know anything about the family history, but kind of, those are the typical things that people do. So I would try something that's a little bit more, what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of where you're including everyone and telling their story if they know it. And I also would think about, actually ask them what they want. I think Hasse mentioned this before. And then know that Juneteenth is, even though we had Emancipation Day and celebrations for African Americans, that was before it was a, seen or adopted and celebrated by everyone as a federal holiday. Or excuse me, as a holiday in Texas or celebrated within the Black community. So yeah, I think just try to talk to your people about what they want. Think outside the box and maybe have people tell stories, or do some type of other activity. But I do want to mention something because I saw in the Q&A that Michelle Marsden corrected me on the Emancipation Proclamation, and I think it's important to not to be corrected, that's fine. And then she said, I actually believe the border states that held the slaves had to wait until the 13th Amendment was ratified to officially end all slavery. And that is correct. So I wanted to add that because Michelle makes a great point. So I always like to, even if I am the person that's talking, I don't know everything. So if the audience can contribute anything and correct me, I'm all about it. So that just means we all need to know more about the 13th Amendment. We need to know more about the Emancipation Proclamation. We need to know more about Juneteenth and slavery in America.
And on that note, Kenyatta, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to sit with us today and help to educate us a little bit. And I want to thank Hasse for being the host and asking great questions. And the rapport between the two of you was really good and easy to watch. And so again, I thank you very much. Before everyone leaves, I do want to take just another moment of your time. And I want to invite you to join us again next month on July 19th. Steve Kowalski will be joining us. He's written a book on creativity and how you bring that out in all of your people, not just those people that we think are gifted, because he believes, his premise is that everyone has the capacity to be more creative. So that's going to be on July 19th. So watch for information about that. A few other housekeeping things that I just want to remind you about. The raffle winner will be notified via email within a week or so. And please watch for the link that will send you the video of this, as well as a little survey asking you for some feedback about today's session. Thank you very much. And if you want to stay in contact with us, I'd like to share some of our contact information. You can reach us by phone, email, and our website will have a whole lot more information. So again, thank you very much, everyone, for joining us and staying with us. I will see you soon. Thank you. Bye.